Hello comrades, it's Comrade Reese here, and a common question that I am confronted with when it comes to talking about socialism and why it is a workable system is, well, how did it work? So comrades, I'll try and make this as clear as possible for you all to understand. Us communists want to spread, and the capitalist class want to prevent the spread of, an understanding of what the October Socialist Revolution of 1917 represented to humanity, and what the Soviet people achieved under working class rule. Because the truth is, if we don't understand the significance of the October Socialist Revolution, then we don't understand anything about the modern world. Our world has been totally shaped by the October Socialist Revolution. Even here in Britain, which feels so far away from the turmoil of proletarian revolution, the way we think, the way we act, the way we live, has been irreversibly shaped by the achievements that workers made in the Soviet Union. The fact is that most of the advantages that we receive as workers in Britain, and which we are told came to us because we are lucky enough to live in a successful capitalist country, by which they mean an imperialist one and a civilized capitalist democracy, are actually weak reflections of the advances that socialism delivered to the workers of the Soviet Union. And because of that, workers all around the world started to demand them too. From the time of the revolution in 1917 up until the death of Comrade Stalin in 1953, that was when the Soviet Union was going from strength to strength. So keep in mind that I am only going to be focusing on the Lenin and Stalin eras, because when Nikita Khrushchev took over after the death of Stalin, he set up some very different reforms. He fucked the whole thing up by changing the Soviet Union's planned economy into a market economy, and he, along with his successors, then took the Soviet Union down the path of dissolution. Anyway comrades, in this video I will be discussing how the Soviet economy worked, how the government worked, how healthcare worked, how education worked, and how housing in the Soviet Union worked. Under the socialist system of the Soviet Union, the means of production were social property, which meant that the means of production belonged to the working people in the form of either the Soviet state or the collective farms and cooperative unions. The products of labour also belonged to the working people. Under the capitalist economic system in other countries, such as Britain, the means of production are the private property of the capitalists. The products of labour also belong to the capitalists. The socialist system of the Soviet Union had completely abolished the exploitation of one person by another. It had abolished wage labour, and that meant that the purpose of production was to produce goods that directly met the needs of the people. Labour power was not a commodity. There was no right to hire and fire, and the workers were paid according to the quality and quantity of their work. Capitalist production, on the other hand, is for the purpose of securing the maximum capitalist profit through the exploitation of the working people. The Soviet economy under Lenin and Stalin was a planned economy, as the steady rise of living standards and purchasing power of the working people were a stimulus to increase production and secure guarantee of freedom from crisis, overproduction and unemployment. Capitalist production, however, develops without a planned economy. The growth of production runs up against the proletarian condition of the working people. It leads to the reduction of their purchasing power, and this inevitably brings a crisis of overproduction, unemployment, and impoverishment of the working people. In the Soviet Union, each worker earned material wealth according to the quality and quantity of his or her labour. The distribution of the national income served to raise the welfare of the working people, extend socialist production, and increase the social wealth. Under capitalism, however, the distribution of the national income takes place for the purpose of enriching the capitalist class. In the Soviet Union, state power belonged to the working class, whose interests were represented by the various bodies of the state and who had an exceptionally high level of involvement in the running of the country, via Soviets, trade unions, factory committees, farm committees, school committees, neighbourhood committees, etc. However, the Soviet state was dictatorial towards the former ruling class, the capitalists, who never gave up on their bid to restore the old, backward, exploitive, brutal order. However, under capitalism, state power belongs to the capitalists, and the working people are compelled to serve the capitalist class to survive, even though they are exploited when doing so. The entire capitalist state is geared towards the armed suppression of the working class. In 1917, the Bolsheviks led the October Socialist Revolution and came to power. They overthrew the capitalist provisional government, and in the capitalist provisional government there was a parliament called the Constituent Assembly, although the capitalists were trying to make it less democratic. However, the Bolsheviks initially took over the Constituent Assembly, but they ended up dissolving it, and what they replaced it with was the All-Russian Congress of Soviets. From the beginning of Lenin's government, the supreme governing body of the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic from 1917 to 1936 was the All-Russian Congress of Soviets, and the All-Russian Congress of Soviets meant that the local Soviets, along with local councils, elected people and sent them to the All-Russian Congress of Soviets, which made laws. But between its sessions there were 12 of these congresses in total. Therefore, the All-Russian Congress of Soviets was not in session all the time, and between the sessions of the All-Russian Congress of Soviets, the highest legislative organ was called the All-Russian Central Executive Committee, and this legislative organ was in session when the All-Russian Congress of Soviets was not in session. Therefore, the All-Russian Congress of Soviets made the laws, but the All-Russian Central Executive Committee ran the government, except when the All-Russian Congress of Soviets was making new laws. The third governing body was the Council of People's Commissars, which was created in 1922, although it did exist in the Russian Civil War as well. But in 1922, the Council of People's Commissars was made as an official part of the Soviet government, and it was also recognized in the 1920s Constitution. What exactly was the Council of People's Commissars? People's Commissariats were very similar to what we would call ministries, and the Council of People's Commissars was a major executive organization of the Soviet government. For example, there would be a People's Commissariat of Agriculture, the People's Commissariat of Defense, and so on. And I think Trotsky was the People's Commissar of Foreign Affairs, Stalin was the People's Commissar of Nationalities and State Control, and he was also the People's Commissar of the Workers' and Peasants' Inspection, which was an anti-corruption body. In 1917, the Bolsheviks quickly came up with these first immediate government organizations, but it wasn't exactly polished. Then, in 1936, the Soviet government went all around the country and they asked people about what they would like to see in the new government, and people were able to participate, send letters or be interviewed and voice their opinions in the discussion about this new constitution. Then this new constitution was put into practice and it introduced a lot of changes. The Soviet Union as a country came into existence in 1922, so around 5 or 6 years after the revolution, and before that it was known as the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic, and when the Civil War ended in 1921, they decided to merge all of these republics into the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, or the Soviet Union as we all know it as. In this new Soviet Union, according to the 1936 Stalin Constitution, the highest legislative organ was the Supreme Soviet, which used to be the All-Russian Congress of Soviets, but was changed into the Supreme Soviet. The Supreme Soviet had 2 chambers with equal rights to make laws. The first chamber was the Soviet of the Union, which was where deputies would be elected by people based on electoral areas, 1 deputy for every 300,000 people, and the Soviet of the Union would be elected for 4 years. The second chamber was the Soviet of Nationalities, and in that chamber people would elect deputies on the basis of 25 deputies from each Union Republic, 11 deputies from each autonomous republic, 5 deputies from each autonomous region, and 1 deputy from each national area. The point of all of these republics was to grant cultural, national and political freedom to oppressed nationalities. Thus, every ethnic group was recognized, and this was done because in the former Tsarist Russian Empire, Russia was known as the prison house of nations. None of the ethnic and cultural minorities were recognized. They were all oppressed, and the only ones who were recognized were the Russians. So there were two chambers, one for the entire Soviet Union and one for the individual republics of the Soviet Union. The bourgeois media, without a doubt, always brushes the question of health under the carpet, but it is a subject which is very important, especially for people who are fighting for improved conditions of life, as good health is fundamental to a decent life. In this comparison of socialist and capitalist societies, I'll try and give a good example of health because it is a fact that every single socialist country has a good record on public health, has prioritised health, has made comprehensive healthcare of the highest quality available to all people, whereas no capitalist country is prioritising this at all. You only have to look at the situation in the world today to see capitalism's regard for health. According to official statistics, 40 million people die every year due to starvation-related diseases. Yet the amount of money that would be needed in order to provide every single person on the planet with decent basic healthcare is equivalent to around 3% of the worldwide annual military budget. So you can kind of see how decadent and wasteful monopoly capitalism has become. Technology and medical science has progressed so much that in this day and age there is absolutely no reason why anyone can go without excellent quality healthcare. There is no reason why all people cannot enjoy good health. If anything, this should be considered to be a fundamental human right. Instead, we face waiting lists and shortages of doctors and beds. In the Soviet Union, the healthcare program was administered in the most democratic way, and like everything in the Soviet Union, its administration had the form of a triangle with a very broad base. The base of this triangle was formed by the thousands upon thousands of committees which existed in every factory, every farm and every workplace. These committees cooperated with the local doctors in order to give feedback and improve services. They made sure that the workers' social insurance funds were spent in the most appropriate way. They controlled the hygienic conditions of their place of work and the nurseries. They also organised health education in the workplace. Elected representatives from the workplace would be involved in the next highest form of organisation, the Soviets. The Soviets were responsible for the supervision of all hospitals and sanitary establishments, sanitary inspections, wider organisation of education and personal hygiene and so on. The next highest form of organisation was the district, of which there were around 3,000 in the Soviet Union. In each district there was a health department headed by a district inspector of public health, who was held responsible for the entire health work of the district. The health departments controlled, inspected and advised all medical institutions in the district. At the apex of the pyramid stood the Commissariat of Health, which was advised by the various scientific research institutions. By organising the healthcare system in such a way, the entire Soviet population was involved directly and therefore felt very strongly about improving the health of the nation. Habits and attitudes of the people changed dramatically from the pre-revolutionary days. Even today, you can see socialist countries such as Cuba and the DPRK becoming world leaders in healthcare, whereas the United States has a healthcare system which is entirely privately owned, and it's the most expensive and inefficient in the world, leaving more than 50 million people without access to healthcare. It is in socialist countries like Cuba and the Democratic People's Republic of Korea that the people enjoy the world's best healthcare and where the greatest innovations in medical science are being made. And that's all thanks to the Soviet Union. If there was no October Socialist Revolution, we wouldn't see this happening right now. In Tsarist Russia, 90% of the population was illiterate. In the Soviet Union, by contrast, besides educating people for higher productivity, Soviet education had to also prepare them to be good citizens. The question of education, then, is critical to the survival of communism and its development towards its higher stage. As Lenin once said, without teaching there is no knowledge, and without knowledge there is no communism. That is why huge resources were nevertheless poured into education, the education of children and adults too. Between 1917 and 1937, 40 million adults were taught to read. The number of children and students in full-time education increased from 8 million in 1914 to 47 million in 1938. Secondary school attendance increased from under a million in 1914 to over 12 million in 1938. Numbers of university students increased from 112,000 in 1914 to 601,000 in 1938. And more schools were built in the Soviet Union in 20 years than the Tsarist autocracy built in 200 years. All schools in the Soviet Union were comprehensive. All students followed the same syllabus. In the Soviet Union, all children learnt one foreign language, all went through the same course in history, geography, Russian and so on. The inevitable difficulties arising from this are got around to some extent by encouraging the students to help each other out with their work. Students who failed a year simply repeated a year. This seemed to have been 5% of all students. Even for the handicapped children, the mainstream syllabus was followed as far as humanly possible. Parents were free to enter the school, and indeed they were expected to do so, to talk to the teachers and even observe classes. Like in a British school today, children kept homework diaries, which had to be signed by parents who could add comments. If the diary was not signed, the teacher would immediately contact the parents. In addition, teachers were expected to visit children at their homes on a regular basis to try and understand what their problems might be and to try and find helpful ways of overcoming them. Parents who failed to take a proper interest in their children's welfare would find themselves surrounded by people taking an interest in their difficulties and trying to help them overcome them. A really uncooperative parent might find their union branch at work asking what the problem is and whether they need time off. The October Socialist Revolution nationalised large homes, and vacant properties were shared amongst the people. Rents were kept to less than 4% of the workers' incomes, and a focus on decent living standards for all was the Soviet state's priority. The Soviet Union tackled a severe housing problem inherited from Tsarism, a problem compounded by the devastation of the War of Intervention and later by the Second World War. The Soviet government put the housing of its people all across the vast territory of the Soviet Union as a high priority that warranted focus, investment and planning. The second decree, issued by the Soviet government on the day after the revolution, abolished the private ownership of land. In towns with over 10,000 people, the government removed the right of private ownership of buildings whose value exceeded a certain limit set by the local organs of power, and so before the end of 1917, large residential buildings had been nationalised. Hundreds of thousands of workers were removed out of the slums and into nationalised houses. Housing policy consisted of redistributing the existing stock by sequestering houses belonging to the bourgeoisie. Just days after the revolution, the People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs issued an order granting the right to sequester empty buildings suitable for habitation and to use them for people living in overcrowded or unsanitary conditions. Having been reduced to a state of ruin by the imperialist war of intervention, Russia was scarred by an acute housing shortage despite the measures taken in the days immediately following the revolution. The material damage caused to housing alone by the Civil War amounted to more than 2,000 million gold rubles. Despite these setbacks, though, resettlement had continued, and between 1918 and 1924, 500,000 workers and their families in Moscow alone were moved into better flats. It was understood, however, that resettlement could not meet the housing needs of all of the working people, and even whilst the White Army and their allies were attacking the Soviet Union, construction of the new houses was underway. In 1920 alone, 254 residential buildings were put up and 2,347 old ones were repaired. While this was no more than a modest beginning, it was an indication of the determination of the Soviet government. Between 1923 and 1927, well over 12.5 million square meters of living space was built in the Soviet Union, and between 1927 and 1931, another 28.85 million square meters of living space was built. It should be made clear that this construction was not confined to the existing old towns. In the 13 years from 1926 to 1939, 213 new towns and 1,323 new urban communities appeared. Overall, the number of towns in the Soviet Union increased from 675 to 1,451 between 1917 and 1951. These new towns and settlements grew up everywhere, in the steppes of Kazakhstan, in the industrial areas of Ukraine, and the Urals and beyond the Arctic Circle. A comparison of the average living area per person in workers' flats before 1917 and in those at the beginning of 1938 shows a striking change. In Leningrad, for instance, the average living area per person doubled. In Moscow, it was up by 94%. So, comrades, I hope I have made this clear enough for you all to understand, and I hope I have also cleared up some misconceptions that you might have had.